On May 18, 2009, a brutal discovery shakes the small Ohio town. In a quiet home nestled among the trees, blood was found splattered across the floor. The tragic tale of a secret affair between a young college girl and her boyfriend's wealthy grandfather had spiraled into madness, culminating in a deadly confrontation. What began as a hidden desire soon erupted into manipulation, obsession, and murder. Ethan Johnson, a 22-year-old college student, had been dating 21-year-old Tiffany Harper for nearly 2 years. They seemed like the perfect couple, young, full of promise, and deeply in love. By the time summer began fading into autumn, Tiffany Harper had found herself drawn into a web she never intended to be a part of. What started as light, flirtatious exchanges at that June 4th, 2008, family gathering soon spiraled into something much more sinister. At first, Robert Johnson's attention seemed harmless. He was Ethan's grandfather, after all, and for a man his age, 76 years, he seemed charming and worldly. But there was something different about the way he looked at her that evening. His eyes followed her every movement, and Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By mid-July, around the 20th, things began to change. Ethan, absorbed in his college life, was often too busy to notice how distant Tiffany had become. With her boyfriend wrapped up in exams and study groups, Tiffany felt an increasing loneliness, a gap Robert was more than willing to fill. She started spending more time at the Johnson family home, under the pretense of helping Ethan with various family matters. But soon, those visits became more about Robert than anything else. What began as harmless conversations about life, school, and Robert's business stories gradually shifted into something else. Robert, with his wealth and years of experience, offered Tiffany an excitement she hadn't realized she craved. Ethan's life was steady, predictable, and focused on the future. But Robert brought unpredictability into her world. He began making promises, and his subtle comments hinted at a life she could have if she stayed close to him. By the time August rolled around, what Tiffany thought was a simple diversion had turned into something much deeper. Robert made it clear how much influence he had over her life, and Ethan's. He spoke often about how he could control Ethan's future, how he had connections within the university, and how a single phone call could ruin Ethan's academic career. Robert's words were always smooth and confident, leaving no doubt in Tiffany's mind that he had the power he claimed to have. As September passed into October of 2008, their secret meetings became more frequent, and Robert's obsession with her intensified. He began orchestrating these encounters carefully, ensuring that Ethan would be none the wiser. The thrill of secrecy that had once drawn Tiffany in began to turn into something darker. Robert grew possessive. He would constantly remind her that she couldn't escape the relationship without severe consequences. He made it clear that she belonged to him now, in a way that felt less like love and more like control. By January 2009, the pressure was weighing heavily on Tiffany. She felt trapped in a situation that had gone far beyond what she had intended. What was once an affair driven by excitement had now become something suffocating. She tried distancing herself, but Robert always found a way to pull her back in. His influence was everywhere. He would remind her of how easily he could destroy Ethan's life with one simple move, how her every decision had repercussions for the man she once loved. In February 2009, Robert's manipulation reached its peak. He began testing Tiffany, seeing how far he could push her, how much control he could exert. Every time she tried to pull away, Robert would counter with a reminder of the damage he could cause. His hold on her grew tighter, and Tiffany could feel herself being drawn deeper into a world she no longer had control over. By the end of February, Tiffany could barely recognize the person she had become. Robert's threats were always lurking in the back of her mind. Every action, every decision felt dictated by his will. She had once thought of him as an exciting escape from her mundane life with Ethan. Now, he was the very force keeping her captive in a life of secrets and fear. The relationship had become a constant source of tension for Tiffany as she felt the walls closing in. And yet, Robert's power over her left her paralyzed, unsure of how to break free. By March 10th, 2009, Ethan couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. Tiffany had become distant, evasive, and increasingly absent. She would often leave without explanation, spending hours away from home. And whenever Ethan asked about it, her answers were vague and unconvincing. It was during this time that Ethan began to feel the cracks in their relationship. He noticed how Tiffany avoided his touch, how she never looked him in the eyes anymore, and how their once comfortable routines had become strained. As the days passed, his suspicions deepened. He tried to convince himself that it was just stress, that Tiffany was maybe dealing with personal issues. But there were too many inconsistencies. Tiffany's phone would buzz late at night, and she would quickly grab it, hiding the screen from his view. She started coming up with reasons to leave the house, claiming she had errands to run or was meeting a friend, but her behavior only grew more suspicious. On March 25th, 2009, Ethan's unease turned into full-blown suspicion. That evening, while Tiffany was in the shower, her phone lit up with a text message. Ethan glanced at it out of the corner of his eye and saw that it was from an unknown number. The message was short, mentioning a meeting that couldn't be missed. It was cryptic, but it set off alarm bells in Ethan's mind. He didn't confront Tiffany right away. Instead, he quietly noted the message, his heart heavy, with the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan's mind was consumed by doubt. Every time Tiffany left the house, he wondered where she was really going. He began to second-guess everything she said, replaying conversations in his mind, trying to figure out what she might be hiding. His trust in her, once rock solid, was crumbling, but he still couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. He needed more proof, something concrete. On April 10th, 2009, everything came to a head. Ethan had finished his classes earlier than usual that day and decided to surprise Tiffany by coming home early. As he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house was eerily quiet, and the front door was slightly ajar, which struck Ethan as odd. Tiffany was always careful about locking up when she was home alone. As Ethan stepped inside, he immediately sensed that something wasn't right. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He walked through the hallway, his footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. Then, as he approached the living room, he heard faint voices. His heart raced as he moved closer, his mind struggling to piece together what he was about to walk into. When Ethan turned the corner, the sight that greeted him shattered his world. There, in the dimly lit living room, he saw Tiffany and Robert together in an intimate position that left no room for misunderstanding. The shock hit Ethan like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His mind struggled to process the betrayal before him, his girlfriend and his own grandfather, together in the house they had shared. Ethan didn't need to hear an explanation. The scene before him said more than words ever could. Without a word, he turned and stormed out of the house, his chest tight with anger and disbelief. The betrayal was too deep, too raw to confront head-on. As he slammed the door behind him, he vowed never to speak to either of them again. Ethan drove away that afternoon, his mind racing with a mix of rage and heartbreak. The trust he had placed in Tiffany was gone, shattered by the realization that she had been carrying on an affair with his own grandfather. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a deep violation of everything he had known and believed in. From April 12th to May 5th, 2009, the relationship between Robert and Tiffany descended into a dark and dangerous spiral. After Ethan's departure, Robert saw his grandson's absence as an opportunity. In his mind, Ethan was no longer a barrier to his obsession with Tiffany. He believed that she could now fully belong to him, and that the affair, once shrouded in secrecy, could become something more. But the reality for Tiffany was much different. The initial thrill she had once felt was gone, replaced by an overwhelming fear of what Robert had become. Robert's possessiveness began to intensify. He started showing up unexpectedly at places he knew Tiffany would be, calling her constantly and demanding her attention in ways that felt suffocating. He believed that with Ethan out of the picture, Tiffany should naturally choose him. He viewed their affair as something more than just a secret. They were, in his eyes, destined to be together. He even began making plans for their future, speaking confidently about what their life could look like. But for Tiffany, these conversations filled her with dread. She had grown to fear Robert, realizing that his obsession was not rooted in love, but in control. The excitement that once blinded her to the truth had been replaced by a deep sense of regret. Robert's manipulation, his threats, and his constant presence in her life were becoming unbearable. Tiffany wanted nothing more than to escape, but Robert had made it clear that leaving him wasn't an option. By May 10th, 2009, Tiffany could no longer take the pressure. She decided that it was time to end things for good. That evening, she went to Robert's home, determined to break free from his control. She had rehearsed in her mind how she would explain that their relationship was over, how she could no longer continue living in fear. But when she arrived and tried to explain her decision, Robert's reaction was not what she had expected. Instead of accepting the breakup, Robert became enraged. His anger boiled over, and he began making threats that left Tiffany terrified. He warned her that if she ever left him, he would ruin her life. He would expose their affair to everyone in town, ensuring that her reputation would be destroyed. But it wasn't just her reputation that Robert held over her. He threatened to ruin Ethan's future as well. Robert knew how much influence he had in the community, and he was ready to use that power to crush both Tiffany and Ethan if she dared to walk away. As the days passed, Tiffany became increasingly desperate. She knew that Robert would follow through on his threats. Every time she saw him or heard his voice, The fear inside her grew stronger. She felt like she was trapped in a cage, with no way out. The weight of her decisions, the fear of exposure, and the suffocating presence of Robert in her life left her feeling like she was losing control of everything. On May 18th, 2009, Tiffany reached her breaking point. That afternoon, she made the decision to confront Robert one last time. She was no longer willing to live under his control, and she believed that this final confrontation would be her chance to escape once and for all. Tiffany arrived at Robert's house around midday. The house, as always, was quiet, its grand exterior hiding the tension that was about to unfold within its walls. When Tiffany entered the house, she found Robert in the kitchen. The confrontation began calmly at first, but the conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument. Robert, unwilling to let her go, once again used his power to manipulate her. He reminded Tiffany of everything he could take away from her, the life she had, the future she wanted. He made it clear that if she left, there would be consequences. As Robert's words grew more menacing, Tiffany felt the panic rising inside her. She could feel her heart pounding, the walls of the kitchen closing in around her. Robert's control over her life, his constant threats, and the overwhelming fear of what he might do pushed her to a breaking point. She knew she couldn't take it anymore. In a moment of desperation, Tiffany spotted a knife on the kitchen counter. Without thinking, she grabbed it. The argument continued to spiral out of control, and before she knew it, she had stabbed Robert. The act itself was a blur, driven by months of fear, manipulation, and a need to escape. She stabbed him multiple times, the knife piercing through his chest and abdomen. Robert collapsed onto the cold tile floor, blood quickly pooling around him. For a brief moment, there was silence. Tiffany stood frozen, staring at Robert's lifeless body. The weight of what she had just done crashed over her. The man who had controlled her life for months, who had manipulated and threatened her, was now dead. The house, once filled with tension, was now eerily still, save for the sound of Tiffany's ragged breathing and the soft drip of blood hitting the floor. Tiffany dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know what to do next. Her mind raced as she backed away from Robert's body, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. The only thing she knew for certain was that there was no going back. Robert was gone, and her life had changed forever in that single, desperate act. The murder itself wasn't planned, but it was the culmination of months of fear and control. Tiffany hadn't intended to kill Robert, but in the heat of the moment, with no way out, she had acted out of sheer desperation. Now, as she stood in the aftermath, she could only think about the consequences that were sure to follow. On May 19th, 2009, Ethan decided it was time to make amends with his grandfather. The anger from the betrayal had begun to settle, and despite the deep hurt, he thought maybe he could patch things up with Robert. Ethan headed to his grandfather's house that afternoon, unaware of the horror that awaited him. As soon as he entered the house, Ethan could tell something was wrong. The air was heavy, and there was an eerie stillness that unsettled him. As he moved deeper into the home, the gruesome scene came into view. The sight of blood smeared across the kitchen floor hit him like a punch to the gut. There, lying in the middle of it all, was Robert, motionless, with a knife still lodged in his chest. The blood had already dried in some places, creating a stark contrast against the cold tile floor. Ethan froze, disbelief washing over him as he tried to process the horrifying image before him. His mind raced, but there was no denying what had happened. His grandfather was dead. The police were called immediately, arriving within the hour. Officers cordoned off the house, treating it as a crime scene. The investigation began swiftly, with forensic teams collecting evidence and documenting every detail of the bloody scene. The knife, still embedded in Robert's chest, was carefully removed and bagged for testing. Blood spatter patterns were analyzed, and officers began taking notes on every possible clue that could lead them to the truth of what had transpired in the house. By May 20th, 2009, the police had already started questioning people connected to Robert. Ethan, as the one who found the body, was one of the first to be interviewed, but it was clear he had no part in the murder. As the investigation continued, attention quickly shifted to Tiffany. Given her involvement with Robert and the tumultuous nature of their relationship, she became a person of interest. When police questioned her, Tiffany initially denied any involvement in Robert's death. She maintained that she hadn't been at the house that day, attempting to distance herself from the crime. However, Tiffany's story began to fall apart under scrutiny. There were inconsistencies in her timeline, small details that didn't match up with what investigators were uncovering. Her nervousness during questioning didn't help, only fueling the police's suspicions. The more they dug into her life, the more questions arose about her relationship with Robert. Neighbors and acquaintances provided statements that hinted at the tension between them, and it became clear that this was no ordinary affair. Tiffany's once secretive relationship with Robert was now under a microscope, and the truth was beginning to surface. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Tiffany began to mount. On June 5, 2009, forensic analysis confirmed that her fingerprints were on the murder weapon. The knife that had been used to stab Robert matched Tiffany's prints, and there was no denying her presence at the crime scene. But that wasn't all. Surveillance footage from a nearby house showed Tiffany arriving at Robert's home on the night of the murder, further solidifying her connection to the crime. The combination of physical evidence and the inconsistencies in her story led to her arrest. Tiffany was taken into custody, charged with the murder of Robert Johnson. The media quickly latched onto the case, turning it into a scandalous spectacle. News outlets painted Tiffany as a young, manipulative woman who had seduced an elderly man for financial gain, only to kill him when things spiraled out of control. Public opinion was divided, with some believing she was guilty of a cold-blooded murder, while others viewed her as a victim of Robert's manipulation and abuse. By August 10, 2009, the trial began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their narrative. They argued that Tiffany had used her relationship with Robert to gain access to his wealth and influence. But when the affair became too much for her to handle, she resorted to murder. They painted her as a young woman who had been caught in a web of deceit, but who ultimately made the decision to kill Robert to protect herself and her future. They brought forward witnesses who had seen the strained interactions between Robert and Tiffany and used the surveillance footage and forensic evidence to build a compelling case against her. The defense, however, presented a different story. They argued that Tiffany had been manipulated and abused by Robert for months, trapped in a relationship she could no longer escape. They claimed that on the night of the murder, Tiffany had acted in self-defense, driven to the edge by Robert's threats and emotional manipulation. The defense team portrayed Tiffany as a victim, someone who had been pushed too far by a powerful, controlling man. They brought up the numerous threats Robert had made, his constant presence in her life, and the pressure he had exerted over her, particularly after Ethan's departure. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but the result of a desperate act by a woman who felt there was no other way out. For 2 weeks, the trial dragged on, with both sides presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and building their cases. Tiffany sat in the courtroom, her fate hanging in the balance as the public watched every moment unfold. Ethan, who had been deeply hurt by the betrayal, never attended the trial. He had cut ties with both Tiffany and his grandfather, unable to reconcile the events that had torn his life apart. On August 25, 2009, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Tiffany was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury had accepted the argument that she had acted under extreme emotional distress, but they couldn't ignore the fact that she had ultimately taken Robert's life. The prosecution's case of premeditation had failed to convince them, but the evidence was clear enough to warrant a conviction. Tiffany was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a punishment that would define the rest of her life. The quiet suburban town of Ohio was left in shock, the scandal of Robert's affair and his gruesome murder leaving a permanent stain on its reputation. Ethan moved away, trying to rebuild his life, but the trauma of the betrayal would haunt him forever. We have so many more shocking stories that will keep you at the edge of your seat, like this insane case where a stepfather's affair with teenage cheerleader ended in murder. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content. Don't forget to check out our next video.